Oh, hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about the political economy, and we're going to start off by tracing out the major difference between the two models of political economy, how the term, the word political economy can mean different things. Sometimes it simply means if you use equations, of which many economists do, um, and things like that. But that's not the meaning that we are going to use it here. We don't go into their we are not going to deal with the equations. Political economy to us for this course would simply mean something as simple as the degree to which the government chooses to become involved in the economy. It's that simple, just the types of ways what that the government passes policies that allow it to control the economy or chooses not to do so. So that's what we mean by political economy. Now, the different kinds of models that are out there when we talk about political economy includes, of course, capitalism. And so I think that's where we should start off with, and we are not really going to be comparing capitalism to socialism too much, but to something else, and that's what today's readings also brings out. I mean, this week's readings also brings out. So let's start off by simply talking about capitalism, what capitalism is. Adam Smith, who is considered the pioneer of capitalism, capitalist thinking, who was born in Scotland in 1776, while the U.S. was worried about other things, he published an epic book titled "An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of the Nations," and there. mm mm, he defines in this book he describes capitalism, and why capitalism is superior to the kind of existing political economic model of the time, which was like during those days, which was all mercantilism. uh, Mercantilism simply was that the government was quite heavily involved in the economy, and Adam Smith was saying that may not be the most efficient model, and he proposed capitalism, not as if capitalism didn't exist. It's not that as if it didn't exist before then, but he said it would be the wisest thing to do. Use the capitalist model that's already exists, and governments should start employing that, and it will be the best for the wealth of all the nation. So let's talk a little bit about capitalism, a little bit about the three major pillars of on which the capitalist system is built. So the first is, of course, the private ownership. Again, this differentiates itself from socialism, or well, maybe not socialism, but certainly communism. And in communism, the government owns so many things, but we have private ownership of especially the capital, which is what Karl Marx calls the means of production. Um, so the capital that allow you to make other things. So capital that needs to be private people's hand, in the private people's hands. So we talk about factories and machineries and those kind of things, because keep in mind, in a communist system or in some other system, maybe with the monarchy or system, that the government claim all these things belong to it, and nobody has right to their own property. So it's not radical what I'm saying, but it's first a choice that you have made, that private ownership is okay, and that you have private property, and that is very important part. That's the first pillar of capitalism. The second aspect is the classic liberal view of, again, a limited role of government in the economy, which Adam Smith called laissez-faire, with the French word for let them do whatever they will. And he described the government should be involved in the economy to a very limited degree, maybe being responsible only for education or the judiciary, the military, those kind of things, but not for most other things. Adam Smith was saying that government should not be providing those things. Private bodies should provide these things, and 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 again, so for him, the government should involve only in these areas. And the final aspects of capitalism is this idea that, well, who should determine the price of the things? How much it should cost a loaf of bread? How much did a car cost? And we and in a capitalistic system, of course, allow these things called market to allocate the prices, to dictate what prices are. And again, this is based on the idea that businesses will be wanting to make profit, so they are not going to charge prices that are too low, because then they wouldn't be able to make a profit. They are not going to on the other hand, they're not going to rip themselves off. And sometimes the government rips itself off. It sells you a service for a lot cheaper than it's worth. The classic example might be the US Post Office, which every year makes loss after loss after loss. And the reason is that it would cost too much money. Um, it's not very efficient, to be honest, but it would cost more money in terms of stamps to get the same kind of service. But so since they make want to make no profit, they're going to keep their prices not so low, but also not too high, because if you put a too high, then nobody's going to pay that, and they're going to go to find somebody else who will charge less for the same thing. This is the system of market allocation. Is known as This kind of market allocation is known as invisible, and it simply means that market, which actually doesn't exist. The market is not some kind of an institution. It's not a building. It's not a group who decides something, but it's simply the laws of demand and supply, and working to create a price for all kinds of things. And again, the alternative to that would be, the government steps in and says how much something is worth. And as we have got up there, labor is also a part of market, and sometimes the government does step in. A classic example there would be minimum wage law. Rather than saying, okay, let's worker decide how long they are willing to go, they say no, for public policy reasons, we don't want anybody making too low of an income, right? Or too low of a salary or a wage. We are going to dictate what the basic bare minimum wage is going to be. So that would be the government actually not letting the market allocate the price. And there are many other ways in which government sometimes steps in, and there will be times when they set certain prices on um, foodstuffs like milk and bread and things like that as well. So, so that's capitalism for us, and hopefully we understand capitalism. And a lot of people don't always understand capitalism. That's pretty sad in the U.S. where we worship it, but let's move on from capitalism. This understanding of capitalism to today's reading. From this understanding of capitalism, let's move on to this week's reading, and we see the fall. We look at the follows reading, which how the world works, and follow wants us to remind us and say, okay, capitalism is not the only game in town. Certainly not this laissez-faire capitalism. This very market type of capitalism is in the West. We always adulate mm, Adam Smith. Um, but in Japan, and this article is about in Japan, he's looking for Adam Smith, but he doesn't find any of Adam Smith, and instead he finds that they're quite enamored with a man called Frederick List, and um, he's born in 1789, so he was only 13 years after the publication of Wealth of the Nations by Adam Smith. So he was a German, but he spent a lot of time in the US. Um, but enough about his history. But what is important here with regard to Frederick List is what he had to say, because in the same way that capitalism, as described by Adam Smith, is a critique. Frederick Leach is a critique, but we should say that counter reaction about against the mercantilists and the system that exists by the mid 80s or early 1800s, when Liszt was writing. Uh, he was saying, okay, capitalism we all embraced. Capitalism, it may not be the best system. I want to talk about mercantilism. Oh boy, Back to the Future. He says another problem, there are several problems with capitalism. And capitalism has this idea of invisible hand. Everybody pursues their own self-interest. Consumers try to pay the least, don't find the most information about products to make sure that they get good products for the least amount of price. Employers are going to try to produce things the cheapest, but still for a certain level of quality. But we do something like that, not always going to be beneficial to everybody. There can be something called what we say market failure, meaning when everybody looks out for their own self interest, you could have a bad result. Uh, Classic example is of that is pollution. By pollution, for instance, where you got to say want to educate your entire population and you turn to private entities. Now, the private entities that are doing that may not really care that some people are not getting a good education. So that can pay those who can pay good education to go to private school to work, and those who cannot go to private school that don't have money, that don't pay very well when they don't have enough money to send their kids, and there is probably get a crappy education. So that would be a classic examples of market failure, where in the area of environment and education, where market may not actually deliver every time in those situations. So in the I gave an example earlier on the course about the healthcare as well, where we left to its own device, the market is pursuing in their own self-interest, led to companies not produce the vaccine for kids because it wasn't as much revenue to be made selling to kids, or not selling to kids by providing kids with flu shots. They are were selling to adults, and that led to kids not having enough vaccine, and they of course were the ones who getting sick, and then this was leading to epidemic. So some cases you really want uh, there to be a government in control. So this is the argument which List is making for against the capitalism. So he says if everyone pursues self-interest, it may not be beneficial always. And the second thing is critiquing about the capitalism here is we tend to say that, certain countries that would simply associate with capitalism